Hey everybody, Bill Sky the Sea Guy, and I've been getting a lot of requests for doing a series on C. And well, let's talk about that a little bit. What is the C language all about? Well, first of all, I've already got a lot of videos out there on C++. I've got some more to do. I've got a lot more to do actually. There's so much there. But also remember that C++ is built on top of C. And what that means is that they took the C language and they extended it into C++. So everything you can do in C, you can do in C++. However, things that you can do in C++, not everything you can do in C++ can be done in C. So C++ is like a superset of the C language. So I'm not going to go through and do all of the same videos in C that I did in C++, especially for things like intrinsic data types like integers and doubles and floats, because that's all the same in C as it is in C++. There are a lot of differences in C++. Like for instance, there's no such thing as object-oriented programming in C. Well, there kind of is, but kind of isn't. But there really isn't. C++ really uses the standardization of object-oriented programming. However, C is a much faster language. It doesn't have as much baggage. In other words, when you create a C program, it's much smaller than a C++ program. The programs normally will run a little bit faster because it doesn't have all that other stuff. And C is really the operating system of choice to create, not the operating system, sorry. It's the language of choice to create operating systems, to develop new operating systems. Now, where does assembler language come in? Well, assembler language is used a lot of times in an operating system to do things at the hardware level that you just can't do in C, or you can do in C, but it's very, very messy to do it in C. So it might be better to do it in assembler language. Other things like device drivers and direct hardware manipulation, things like that. So a C program will call an assembler language function or an assembler language module or program. C++ is really used more for business-like programming, programming possibly games, things like that. So you definitely want to learn C, but you want to learn it from the point of view of how does it differ from C++, and that's what we're going to do in these series of videos. So what are some of the things that are the same in C++ as are in C? Well, the assignment statement, comments, constants, scope, global variables. You've got basic arithmetic, advanced arithmetic. Pretty much all of that is the same. If statements are the same. My goodness, while, do while, and for loops are all the same. The go-to statement, that's the same. The definition and calling of functions, that's the same too. Arrays, one-dimensional, multi-dimensional arrays, they're all pretty much the same. So we're not going to go through all that, but what I'm going to do is in the description or the overview of this video, I am going to place the links to my C++ videos that are applicable to C as well. And the other thing we're going to do in these videos is that we're going to assume that you've got your development environment set up. I'm going to put the links to those videos in this description as well. And we're going to be concentrating on using MSys2 MinGW64. I'm going to show you Visual Studio. I'm going to show you the differences between the Visual Studio code that Microsoft generates for you. It's got a lot of Windows only stuff in it, but you really don't want to concentrate on just Windows. And we're probably going to also do some Mac stuff to show you how to do this on a Mac if you've got a Mac. Also, which IDE are we going to use? Well, I'm going to concentrate mainly on using Eclipse just because Eclipse is mature. It's got all of its, well, I shouldn't say all of its bugs, but it's got a lot of bugs out, and it's also developed by developers. We are going to touch on Visual Studio, as I said earlier, also Visual Studio Code, Xcode we're going to touch on, and then I'm also, everything you can, the reason that we're going to concentrate using MSys is because MSys is like a little Linux environment, and that means that if you use MSys and you know how to use that, you're going to almost automatically understand how to use it on Linux. So we are going to have some examples of that. So I think the first thing we should do here is just create our first program, and C program. And I'm going to do this using Eclipse. I'm also going to then do it using Visual Studio, then Visual Studio Code, and then we'll do it on Xcode to show you that. And then I'll show you how to do it on Linux as well. It's much the same as using MSys. So if you haven't got your development environment set up, if you haven't watched, Well, actually, those are really the only ones you need for this video here. So make sure you have your development environment set up, and then we'll move on from there. So let's get going. Hey, so now we're here. We have a Windows 11 running. Now, if you're wondering why it might look kind of funny, there's a title bar. That's because this is Windows 11 running in a VMware guest operating system on my big Mac Pro. And so it makes it easier for me to jump between operating systems. So what we're going to do first here is we're going to load up Visual Studio. Not Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio. Now, why Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code is because Visual Studio is really the enterprise professional level development tool. Now, somebody might get mad at me for saying that because they love Visual Studio Code. You know, it doesn't matter. It's just style. It's what your employer wants you to use. Depending upon what it is that your employer wants to use, that's what you really need to use. I've had students refuse to use tools that I've asked them to use in class, and I've had to fail them because they're so stubborn. And if you think about it, if you go and you do that in a business, they're not going to fail you, they're going to fire you. So we're going to touch on all of these. Don't worry about it. We're going to touch on all of them, and it's a good idea for you to learn all of these anyway. So, okay, so when Visual Studio starts up, and again, if you haven't installed Visual Studio yet, it might be a good idea to go take a look at the link for that because I have a link to that video. You get this welcome screen. I'm going to click on Create a New Project. And there are so many different projects that Visual Studio has that can actually be very, very confusing. But I'm going to go down here and I'm just going to select C++. I'm going to select Windows. And then I'm just going to select a console program. And you can see an empty project. You can see a console app. Let's just go ahead now. If you notice, there's no C here. It's almost like Microsoft is ignoring C. I don't believe that's the case. I think what they're doing is they're just saying that C++ is built on top of C, so it doesn't matter. It's going to use the same compiler, Visual C++. So I'm just going to select a console app and click Next. I'm going to just call this Test C. Now, Visual Studio does not use the open source MinGW. It doesn't use MSys. It doesn't use any of that open source stuff. So it uses a specific Windows compiler called Visual C, VC. And when it comes up, you'll see this here. It includes the IO stream. If you go over here to the source files, you can see the test CBP. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that. So I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm just going to say delete it or remove. And I'm going to say delete. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new source file. And I guess it's thinking here a little bit. I just updated this Visual Studio, so it might take a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to right-click. I'm going to say Add. And I'm going to say New Item. And I'm going to call this main.c. Now, C programs end with .c. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. And it's empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some includes. So I'm going to say pound include std lib.h, pound include stdio.h. I'm going to say int main, int argc, char argv. I'm just going to say put s, welcome to my first C program, and return 0. And let's see how that, I might got those includes, I think I got the includes right. Let's go ahead and build that and see if I got it right. Now, the Visual C will compile this differently because the end of the extension on this file is main.c, not main.cpp. So that means that it's a C program. So let's go ahead and I'm going to say debug, start without debugging. And there you go. Welcome to my first C program. So there you go. So it's a little bit more complicated with Visual Studio because they're not assuming that you're going to be writing C, which I don't understand because C is such a popular language, especially for low-level coding, operatings and the such. But while we're here, let's go ahead and talk about these different things. So the pound include stdlib.h. Now, if you've done some C++ programming, you notice that cstdlib doesn't have a .h at the end. And what is the .h? The .h is a header file. It simply includes constants and function prototypes and things like that that your program may need. stdlib is just some of the standard functions that you need to write a C program. So that's what that is. The next one, stdio.h, that is the one that does the put s, as you see it right underneath the main there. It has input and output features, so allowing you to do user input, like keyboard input, output if you're a C++ programmer, C in and C out. You can't do that in C, but things like scanf and putf or printf are part of that. And then we've got our main, and our main is the entry point into the program. Int means it's going to return an integer specifying what the status of the main function was when it was finished running. Int argc are the number of arguments you typed when you ran the program after you typed the program name. So argc has the number, and then argv, that is an array of strings, of C strings, that has each argument. We're going to get into that in this course, or I'm going to have a link to it in the C++ course. And then put s, that is simply says put string. It says welcome to my program, and then we return 0. The 0 is the number that the main is returning. So you don't have to understand all of that right now until you get to the functions discussion that I'm going to have in the C videos, because the functions are the same. And then we've got the open and close braces here that specify the scope of the main function. So there you go. So that's with Visual Studio. Now let's go ahead and close that, and let's start up. I had MSys updating. MSys is still updating. MSys is the infrastructure. It's the compiler and everything that's the open source, and it's compatible with Linux, compatible with Mac, and it runs on Windows as well. In fact, a lot of programs will use that, or were developed under that. So we're going to do that. Now you can do that from the command line, or you can do it from Eclipse, and I'm going to do it from Eclipse. You can see we just ran Visual Studio. We can run Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go ahead and start up Eclipse right here, and I just updated my Eclipse to the 2023-12 version, December 2023, and let's go ahead and create a C program. I'm going to be making that mistake a lot. A C program using Eclipse, and then we'll do it on Visual Studio Code, and then we'll do it on Xcode. And Xcode is a lot like it was on Visual Studio, except it's a Mac only. Okay, so here we go. We're going to launch our workspace. Let's go ahead and update that. I just went ahead and upgraded my Eclipse, so it's got a little bit of work to do while it's loading up. While that's going on, I'm going to start up my Visual Studio Code just so that can be up and running, so we can jump right into that. Okay. Let's go back to our Eclipse, and let's get that done. Okay, so there's my Eclipse. Now let's go ahead and create our first project. I'm going to say File, New, C++ project. And then Eclipse knows about that because developers have developed Eclipse, and developers know that they're still using C. So I'm going to click on C Managed Build and click Next. And then I'm going to just give it a test C name. And then I'm going to specify Hello World. And I'm going to select the compiler I want. Now I have both LLVM and the MinGW GCC, so I'm going to click on the MinGW GCC. Click Next. I can put my name in there if I want. And I'm going to turn off Release because we're not going to be releasing this product. We're just going to be playing around with it. And then I click Finish. And if you notice, it does everything for us. There's a little bit difference here. It added a bunch of comments. I didn't feel like typing all of those in. And it also returned a constant, exit success. Now I believe exit success is part of the stdlib.h include file, or the header file, and it's basically 0. So I'm going to go ahead and build that, and it's done. If you've noticed, this is going a lot faster after it initially came up. And then I'm going to go ahead and run it, and I'm going to select local C++, or C. You don't have to do this multiple times, just the first time you run it. And it says Hello World. So that's in Eclipse. And this is using the MSys2 compiler. Now, if you're wondering what is he talking about, the MSys2 compiler, well, I'm going to close Eclipse. And I'm actually go down here to the search, and I'm going to type MSys2. And I can come down here and click the MSys2 MinGW64. And let's go ahead and change the font a little bit, just so it's a little bit easier for you guys to see. I'm going to go to Text, select the font. Let's go to a 14 font. Okay. So what is he talking about, the MinGW compiler? Well, first of all, Eclipse is not a compiler. Eclipse is simply an integrated development environment that calls a compiler. Visual Studio is the same thing, and so is Visual Studio Code. Xcode is for that matter as well. So the really neat thing about MSys is that it it installs a little Linux on your computer. And maybe not, maybe it's not really a little Linux, maybe it's an emulation of a Linux, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to make directory documents. I'm going to change documents, and then I'm going to make directory C, change to C. I'm going to make directory hello world, change directory hello world. And now I'm going to create a file. I'm going to say nano main.c, and nano's an editor. So I'm going to say pound include stdlib.h, pound include stdio.h. I'm going to say main. And I'm just going to say print s, or put s, I believe it was. And I'm going to return 0. And that's it. My program's done. I'm going to press Control X to leave and save it. And now I'm going to compile it. So I'm going to say gcc-compile. Actually, let's just say main.c-o main. And there's my main.exe. So I'm not using Visual Studio Code. I'm not using Visual Studio. I'm using Eclipse. I'm just doing it from the command line. And then I can go ahead and just say main.exe and the program runs. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. Hello world. So you can do it from the command line as well. Now, to be able to use Eclipse or Visual Studio Code, you've got to install a compiler, and that's what the MSys 2 package is. So let's do this in Visual Studio Code. Now, when you install Visual Studio Code, you have to click on this little extensions icon, and you have to do a search for C++. And I always like to install the Microsoft extensions. I don't like to install other people's extensions because they're not really supported. They could be. I could be wrong about that, but I've always felt funny about third party. So I always install the C or the Microsoft products. So I'm going to go up here to Explorer, and I'm going to say Open Folder. And from there, I'm going to go, and this is on Windows. I'm going to go to Windows. I'm going to create a new folder here. I'm just going to call this C. I'm going to go into that new folder, Hello World. I'm going to go with that and say Select Folder. So Visual Studio Code works on a folder paradigm, where Eclipse works on a workspace paradigm. And the workspace is a folder in Eclipse. They just called it differently. So I'm going to go ahead and trust all that. Visual Studio Code seems to be very worried about security. I don't know much about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. I know about security. I just don't know much about why they keep asking about trusting. So I'm going to go up and click plus for the file, and I'm going to call it main.c. And from there, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, one nice thing about Visual Studio Code, if you might have noticed, it helps you finish off your coding. It has code completion for you. I wish I had copy and pasted all this because it's exactly the same. I wonder if I could have said return exit. Yep, I could have said return exit success if I want. All right. So let's go ahead and save that. Oh, it says I have an update. I'll do that later. So let's go ahead and save that. I'm just going to press Control S. And now I want to go ahead and build it. So to build it, I'm going to go to Go. I'm going to... Actually, where is that? I have all these instructions. Yeah, I don't actually see it right here. Let's see. So Well, view terminal will get you the terminal, and I could compile it from there if I wanted. So let's go to this little. It was hidden from me because the menu isn't there. I'm going to go the three dots, and I'm going to say run build task dot dot dot. So I'm going to click on that. It says, okay, what do I want to do here? It asks me, what do I want to compile? Well, I want to use the GCC out of my MinGW MSys64, so I'm going to double click on that. Okay, it says the build completed successfully. So now let's see if we say terminal or run without debugging. Let's see what it gives us. And I'm assuming it takes a little while the first time you've run it, but let's see. I'm not really sure where it is. Let's go to output. Let's go to debug console, terminal. Yeah, I'm not really seeing it running there. So let's say start debugging it. And let's use the GDB LLDB debugger. And see, it's not quite as cooked as you got to change some things in the JSON file. So I do have a link in this video as to how to do all this. I'm not looking at it right away, and I don't use Visual Studio Code a whole lot. Let's see if we can't get this going. Yeah, it's interesting. So again, take a look at my other video. You'll see it's a little bit more involved. I'm not sure why so many young people like Visual Studio Code. Maybe because it was really meant for HTML, XML, and things like that, and JavaScript and all that. And you have to add the C and the C++. But again, I've got this working in another video. Go ahead and take a look at that, and you'll see that running. Okay, so now how would you do this in Linux? Well, if you saw when I did the MSys2 MinGW64, that's basically how you would do it in Linux with the command line. So let's go ahead and take a look at this really quick on Linux. So we've got Linux here running. Now this is Mint Linux 21.3 or is 21.2, it doesn't really matter. And this is the really cool thing about Eclipse is that it runs exactly the same on Linux as it does on Windows, as it does on Mac. Well, I shouldn't really say that because on a Mac the debugger isn't quite working simply because Apple keeps changing things. But you also see I have Visual Studio Code installed here as well. And on Linux, it's exactly the same way. Now, if you're wondering why I'm using Mint Linux, it's because it's the closest to Windows 7 of any Linux out there, and I really liked Windows version 7. But you do it exactly the same way. You say New Project. I'm going to go down to C and C++. I can just click C Project by itself. Click Next. Test C. Now, this is assuming that you have installed all the development tools on your Linux. So I do have a link on how to do that from a C++ perspective, which is exactly the same thing. And you can see it right there. And I could go to a dark mode here. So I'm going to go ahead and just build this. And it built really fast. I mean, Linux is really, really fast. And I'm going to go ahead and run this. And the first time you run it, it asks you, is it C++ or Fortran? I'm going to say C. And there you go. So hello world. So Linux isn't much different than the MSys software. Let's take a look at this on Mac. All right, so here I am on my Mac, and I'm not using VMware in this case just because I'm on a Mac. So I've got Xcode up and running, and again, there is a link in the description of this video on how to get all that set up. I'm going to click on New Project, and then I'm just going to tell I want it to be a command line tool, and I'm going to click Next, and that's going to ask me what language I want. Well, Xcode has C. So I'm going to just call this test C. And I actually have never done this on a Mac. Let's see how this works out. Let's see what code it creates. And I'm just going to save this to my desktop just so it's easy to get rid of because I'm not going to continue to use this. And let's see what Xcode creates for us. So there's our main. So let's just double click on our main. And there you go. So it does include a bunch of stuff. Now notice it doesn't include stdlib.h, and that may be because the Mac's stdio.h file includes the std.h file. That doesn't mean I can't do it. I can say pound include stdlib.h, and I'm going to go ahead and just press play. And if you go to the menu at the top of your screen, when you have Xcode running, you'll actually be able to see where you can just compile it if you want. But just playing it compiles it, links it, and then prints it, or then runs it, and then there you go. So then it runs. So now, if you really love Visual Studio Code, there is a Visual Studio Code for the Mac, so you can go ahead and download that too. But like I said, just for ease of programming and for compatibility across operating systems, I'm going to be sticking with Eclipse in these series of videos. But that doesn't mean you can't use your other tools. Now, when we get into more advanced C, which include multi-file, multi-program source code files, you're going to see that Visual Studio Code is not as easy as any of these other tools. I'll show you how to get that set up because I do have that information and I have used it many times, but you'll see how that can be a little more complex. Okay, so that's your introduction to C, getting started with it. Go ahead and take a look at those other videos that I have in the link as to how to get caught up. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to start doing what are the differences. And I believe it's going to be, first of all, with keyboard input and display output, how to get stuff off of the keyboard, how to print it to the screen, much like C in and C out in C++. Go ahead and take a look at all those initial videos or the videos on C++ that are applicable to C, and you'll be all set. Hope to see you at our next video.